The Greenskins are one of the most relentless forces in the game. Once they set their sights on you, you're locked into a conflict that will only end one of two ways. Either you wipe them from the face of the map, or your campaign comes to an early end. With their wars, and collection of boys big and small, they can be a terror to face both on and off the battlefield. So today, let's go through how to beat them both in campaign and battle, starting on the campaign map. If you're playing as a faction that's even remotely close to the Greenskins, chances are you're going to end up fighting them at some point. They're just so aggressive to any neighbours, so that combined with the anti-player bias means they'll be knocking on your door soon enough if you're anywhere close. So when they do eventually come knocking, there's only really 3 mechanics you really need to worry about. First things first, the war. It's their most iconic mechanic and also one of their strongest. Once they build up enough reputation, they can call a war, and this will essentially double the power of all of their current armies. Every one of their lords will start to slowly accumulate a second army that travels around with them, the same size as their main army at the time of calling. These wars always have a target, but all that really means is an end goal. Once they're going, they can use that doubled power on anyone they see, and the AI being what it is, that normally means you. Even if they aren't targeting you, successfully completing a war will reward the faction and make it much easier for them to start the next one, giving them quite the snowball if they do this a few times. So taking out the war in faction before they can do anything too crazy should be a relatively high priority if they're anywhere close to you, but how do you do it? The way I see it, you have a few options. The first one only really works if you're really close to the faction and their armies, and that is to attack them before the war or right as it's starting. The way the extra units work is a slow build up over time to match the size of the parent army when the war is activated. If you wipe out their armies on a regular basis, then they'll have no power to double. If a war has just started, they'll likely only have a handful of extra units, so taking them down now will be much easier rather than later when they're fully doubled. As I said, this will only work if you're really close to them, since you need to be on them below 5 turns for this to be effective, so we need a new plan if you're not. The second option is the most obvious, and that's to double your own army power the old-fashioned way, with 2 armies. You may not be able to move them around as one, but during your turns you can move armies next to each other to even the odds. This means you'll never be outnumbered if you take on their armies 2-on-1, but it does have a few downsides. Obviously, you'll need to pay for double the armies, which is not cheap. It's a little bit more micro, both for the campaign and battle, and if you come up against them with 2 armies, you'll need 4, and that's just getting out of control. Now the third option is Lightning Strike. If you have this skill maxed out, you can attack armies with a war attached, and with the simple check the box, just fight the host without worrying about reinforcements. Now this does go for both sides, so you'll need to make sure that your army can beat whatever the host army brings, but if you manage to take them out completely, the Y units will just disappear without ever seeing battle, which is a pretty sweet deal for you. Of course, this is a bit of a skill point investment these days, so most of your lords won't have this until later on, but once they do, Y armies are no more a problem than normal armies. If you don't have Lightning Strike and you're thinking you can rush the main force before the Y army reinforces them, this can work, but only when they're attacking you. If you attack them, they reinforce in seconds, so you have no chance and shouldn't rely on this if you can help it. Now, outside of these 3 options, if you're going against armies with strong units, there's not a lot else you can do. However, if you keep tabs on Greenskin armies and notice they're full of weaker lower tier units, then even if they do war, they're only going to get more weak units since the power matches the host army. So, if you can get vision of what units they're using, you can target the weaker armies with just 1 elite army of your own and take on a full stack with a full war, no problem, either through auto-resolve, which doesn't tend to value quantity too much, or manual battle, where you can pick apart weaker units no problem. Now, outside of the war, they have a couple more mechanics which can make them pretty tough to go up against, but none are as in depth, so there's not 1,000 more words coming out on how to counter one thing. Their second mechanic you should worry about in the campaign is Tribal Confederation. This means when they face another Greenskin faction leader in battle, if they win, they have the option to confederate the other, and this option is chosen basically all the time by the AI. This means that Greenskins can expand at a truly scary pace if they keep battling other Greenskin faction leaders. Especially in the Badlands, there are like 4 or 5 in a very small area, making it stupidly easy for one faction to go on a pretty crazy roll and own a significant portion of the map in no time. This obviously makes the Greenskins into a real hassle to fight since you have to take out so many damn settlements to get rid of them, and at any point, they can pick a fight with another leader and gain a bunch more. Now, there is exactly one way to counter this, and it's not exactly desirable or practical. If you simply make sure Greenskin faction leaders are always off the map, then they can't really beat each other or confederate. Does this mean you need to be at war with all of them at once and be constantly battling not only whatever is going on in your own wars, but also scouting for faction leaders to assassinate? Yes. Is literally anyone ever going to do this in their campaign? No. Honestly, this mechanic is just something you have to deal with and be aware of. If they get a bunch of new land in a single turn, just know it's because of this and be ready for them to use their new lands and armies to attack you. You can counter this, but it's more of a hassle than just letting them get on with it and dealing with it once it happens. And their final mechanic is something that we've covered a bunch of time in this series, and that is the underways. It works the exact same as everyone else's, letting them cross impassable terrain, no problem, and avoid armies to a frustrating degree. If you don't have this stance yourself, then the only real way to catch them are having armies either side of the terrain they keep hopping across, which is pretty impractical, or by using mind games. If you place a weak army on one side of that terrain and have another army nearby in ambush stance, the AI will get so rock hard about taking out your weak army that they'll most likely jump across, and once it rotates back to your turn, you can bring your ambush and take them down. This also works for settlements if you leave a weak one undefended with an ambush nearby. As long as you can put something of yours that they can easily take out in their vision, they won't be able to help themselves, and as soon as they move, they're done for. Finally, we can move on to battle, and while the Greenskins are for sure a strong battling faction, their focus is relatively simple throughout the entire roster. Everything is all about all-out aggression and attack, with little thought for defense and survival. From their melee troops to their monsters, all of them share this trait, and it makes taking them down no problem, but coming out unscathed into a bit of a problem. Even with this singular focus, they have a bunch of areas of their roster that you need to look out for. Their melee roster is a mix of faster, weaker goblins and slower, stronger orcs. Generally, the orcs will be the biggest threats, especially in the late game, with the black orcs being the pinnacle of this, with massive armor and huge armor-piercing damage and melee attack. Their defense isn't amazing, but with armor like that, you'll need some serious weapon strength to even make them feel it. However, they lack any range defense, so they'll feel every single missile you send their way. They also have an extensive list of monsters from the early trolls to the late game giant spiders, giant rockmen, and giant giants. Again, there's a massive focus on attack with little consideration for defense. There's some missile resistance and armor here and there, but again, that's really banking on the damage output to carry them through, so are very open to being hit just as hard. The cav roster is much the same as the melee infantry, with a mix of goblins and orc for speed and strength respectively. Again, they lack any defense, but since most of these are shot cav, that's totally fair enough. They're not overly quick, but still plenty fast enough to be a problem for backlines, so keeping them at bay with melee infantry or fast units of your own should be a high priority. If you can pin them down and get them into melee, they should go down in moments, so no matter how you do that, you'll have no problems. The ranged roster is pretty weak, I can't lie, with the one exception being the Doom Diver Catapult. This thing has monster range, great damage, and incredible accuracy from those brave little soldiers piloting the missiles. Like all artillery pieces, they'll go down in a second against the weakest unit that gets close, but with a range like that, you'll need something fast to close the gap quick enough to matter. Outside of their units, their leadership has a pretty strong selection of magical laws, with the Little and Big Waa both having some pretty crazy spells, with the Star of course being big. I mean, it can summon a giant foot to stomp on enemies, as well as offering insane buffs that fit perfectly with the aggressive playstyle. Combine this with the fact that even Orc Shamans can be pretty terrifying battlers, and there's not one bit of their armies you can underestimate. All units on the roster also come with slightly above average speed. It's nothing crazy, but compared to the Empire, for example, most Orc units have 1 more speed, whilst Goblins are looking at about 5 or so higher. It's not exactly going to drastically change the game, but just be ready for them to move a little bit faster than most factions you come up against, and plan accordingly so you're not caught out. One last thing to worry about in battle is the other kind of Waa. Every entity the Greenskins have in melee generates combat Waa points, and once they gather enough, they can trigger their army's Waa ability, which varies from lord to lord, but generally you're looking at some increased damage and melee attack for somewhere around 20 seconds. This can be pretty scary since their damage output is so high already, but there isn't really a way to counter this outside of somehow preventing their units from getting into melee, which is borderline impossible. The only ways to lessen the impact of this would be spells and abilities that reduce the damage and attack, and focusing on taking down as many melee entities as you can to reduce the number of points generated. They can trigger this effect as much as they want, but each subsequent use needs more points, so if you take out entities fast, they might only get off 1 or 2 instead of 3 or 4. So now we have all their strengths, we can build an army to counter them, and would you believe me if I said it was going to be ranged focus? First things first though, melee infantry. Since the Greenskin attack is so high, trying to outdamage them likely isn't going to happen, so instead we're going to focus on defense, specifically melee defense. There won't be a lot of range damage, so melee defense will save your units from taking far more damage than any amount of armor, so prioritize this over everything. This meant I went with halberds, which also works great for defending against their large units, like cavern monsters, so it's a perfect fit. For the ranged infantry, it's as much armor piercing as possible, so of course we're going to take handgunners. Against their huge monsters, these guys will have no problem landing shots, so use them to focus major threats and they should have no problems. Once massive targets are dealt with, chances are the lines will look a little bit wonky, so find yourself an angle and take out whatever's left. If they do get caught out by cav, try not to panic and simply contain the attack to as few units as possible before bringing in aid and getting them back to shooting as soon as you can. Just do your best to keep them safe and firing as much as possible, and you should have no problems. Next, you'll want something to hunt cav and get into their flanks to take out what few ranged units they'll bring. This can be anything fast, but in my case was some demigryphs, and I went with halberds. Since Greenskins have so many monsters and large units, it just makes sense to bring a bit more anti-large damage. Plus, this will make cav hunting a little bit easier with some meaty damage. Lastly, for leadership, a spellcaster that can reduce melee stats and damage of enemies is a great idea to counter any wars or weaken some particularly nasty units. Shadows is always good at everything, but honestly, most lores have something for this, so just pick whatever works best from what options you're playing with. For a lord, I'd say something to inspire leadership in nearby troops, since those halberdiers are going to be going through it on the front lines and need a level head to keep them confident. With this sort of comp, which I've realised that I've ended up making to counter everyone, you'll want to play as defensively as you can. If they have Doom Divers, they'll likely outrange you, so you'll need to make the approach, but once the gap is closed, try to keep your army tight and your flanks secure. If they can manage to break your lines and overwhelm you, it'll go downhill fast with their damage output. But if you can hold them still and survive their massive damage output whilst focusing down their key targets, they should go down eventually, even if they do take most of your front lines with them. You're probably just going to have to make peace with that. And that is everything on how to beat the Greenskins. Let me know if you have any more questions or even tips of your own in the comments below. Like, subscribe, and if you want to know how to beat more factions, then how about this video on how to beat the High Elves.